advocate for Catholic charities and does a lot of the advocacy work for the Diocese with the Idaho state legislator. And someone who needs no introduction at this point, Jack Jezreel. So I'll turn it over to them.
Well, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Is that better? I thought it was. Is that better? Is that better? Okay. All right. So Christine and I chatted. I'm going to do about 20 minutes, a 30,000-foot view on the topic of advocacy and legislative engagement and faith and politics, if you will. And then Christine's going to do the last 40 minutes with some specifics about how that expresses itself in the Diocese of Boise. How's that sound? Okay? So I'll start where I started yesterday, which is just to remind us that the Catholic view of creation is a very positive one, and what we imagine, the way we talk about God's relationship to this world is it is showered with grace, and the assumption about the potency of that grace is that it has the power to transform human beings, who are then capable of transforming the world. And when we talk about transforming the world, the reign of God, if you will, in part, we think about how it can transform individual lives, right? And we think about how grace and faith can transform family. True? And how grace and God's Spirit can transform neighborhood. True? And how God's grace and power can transform all things human. True? Including politics? True? True? Yes, the Catholic view. I mean, here's the point. The Catholic view about politics and economics is a very positive one. That is, the Catholic view of politics is that politics has an important part to play in the earth, in the world being made right. And the language we use is justice, right relationships. That politics has a role to play, that economic structures have a role to play, that all things human can either be demonic or holy. All things human can be destructive, or they can make things whole. Okay, so that's the Catholic view on the engagement between our faith and politics. And I just want to be very deliberate about that, because I think part of the crisis connected to the fact of Catholic social teaching continuing to be our best kept secret is that many Catholics don't understand that there is actually a kind of Catholic politic. And what I mean by that is there is actually a political platform of the Catholic Church. Well, according to Jack. And what I mean by that is, and I'm being only slightly playful, is that sometimes when I'm talking about Catholic social teaching and its relationship to the political reality, and somebody will raise their hand and says, well, they'll say, is Catholic social teaching liberal or conservative? And my response is, you're right. You're right that the church's view has a very, very strong political bias. And at this point, everybody's leaning off their seat, right? You see what I'm saying? And I say, and our politics can be named in 3 simple words, or 5 words if you like, or 9 words if you want the long version. And the interesting thing about our political platform, it's the same as our spirituality. And here it is. Everybody is precious. That's our politics. Everybody and everything is precious. And the longer view goes like this. Everybody and everything is precious to God, and everybody is precious to God, and therefore to me. Now that's our politics. And we take that into the political arena, and we make the case, not because we assume everybody's Christian or Catholic. We try to translate our view that all human beings are precious, that that not only are we precious individually, but we're precious collectively. We take that view into the political conversation and try to use language that can be persuasive, not only to people of faith, but people who don't share the same faith that we have. Now, yesterday I also spoke about how we appropriate, if you will, the invitation of Jesus. I used a heart image. You might remember yesterday the heart grew bigger and bigger. So I'm just going to draw the heart again. In some ways, this is one way to speak about who God is. God, according to the Johannine writings, God is love. And we as incarnate vessels of that love in this world, following in the footsteps of Jesus, as we seek to do this transforming work, this healing work, this making whole work in the world, one way to describe pieces of how that heart expresses itself is charity and justice. And you saw the booklets that were passed out, and I think this is probably familiar to most of us in the room, but I happen to know it's not familiar to everybody in the room. Just a quick word. One way to describe the difference in the relationship between charity and justice is a very popular story that some of you have probably heard 137 times, and now this will be 138. There's this guy in his backyard, and he loves to be in his backyard because he's got a garden, and it's a beautiful place. His yard dips down into a creek. Sometimes there's ducks and good geese on the creek side, and so he's out in his garden one day, and he's tilling his little garden, and it's a hot day, and he puts his hoe down on the ground, and he wipes his brow, and he looks down at the creek expecting to see ducks or geese, but instead of ducks or geese, he sees a body, or it looks like a body, in the creek. So he runs down to the creek, and lo and behold, it's the body of a half-drowned, bleeding woman. So he picks her up and he carries her back to his house, and he spends the next 2 months nursing her back to health. And after 2 months, she's strong enough to get up. She thanks him very much. She goes out the front door. He goes back to his garden. He starts weeding again. And he's weeding, and it's another hot day, and he wipes his brow, looks down to the creek. 2 bodies. So he runs down to the creek, pulls out the half-drowned, bleeding bodies of these 2 guys. He carries them back to his house. He spends the next 2 months nursing them back to health. After 2 months, they're strong enough to get up. They go back out the front door. They thank him. He goes back to his garden. He starts weeding, and he says to himself, "I'm not looking up." But he can't help himself. And so he looks up, and 3 bodies. And the movement from charity to justice begins with a very simple question. What is going on upstream? Right? In other words, the movement from charity to justice is to move from addressing the symptoms, if you will, the outcomes of a problem, and trying to get at the root causes of the problem when there are root causes of a problem. Are you with me? And so when we move into the arena called justice, trying to address, if you will, root causes, we often get into systemic problems that have systemic causes, then part of the expression of how we get engaged is political engagement. In other words, we engage our faith, if you will, on behalf of those and with those whose voice we add ours to for the purpose of broadening and building energy for some possibility of systemic change. And I just want to say, by the way, as an aside, because I heard this come up when Deacon Gary was giving his presentation, and I hear this 1,000 times, so this is a little added piece that I'm just throwing in there for free. And that is this. Parishes will say this. Jack, I often do consultation with parishes somewhat frequently, and they'll say, we really get the charity thing, but we don't get the justice thing. And I say, really? Tell me about that. And they'll say, well, after the Haiti earthquake, we had a collection, and that weekend we collected $17,463.14. I said, wow, that's a lot of money. What else? And they said, well, if you need another example, St. Vincent de Paul was collecting used mattresses, so our parish collected 847 used mattresses, last month. And I said, wow, that's a lot of mattresses. What else? And they said, well, if you need more evidence, the Lions Club was collecting used eyeglass frames, and we collected 347,618,512 eyeglass frames. And I said, well, that's a lot of eyeglass frames. What else? And they say, well, what else do you need? And I say, well, so far what you've described is not charity. And they say, it's not? I say, no. Charity is about relationship. Charity is fundamentally relationship. You know how almost every city, every mid-major city, or at least I'll just describe Louisville, and this is a lot like so many other cities. In Louisville, Kentucky, where I'm from, there's almost, you can name the street that divides the wealthy side of town from the poor side of town. There's this kind of invisible wall, and people on one side of the town are actually scared to go to the other side of town. Oftentimes how charity works is those on the rich side of town who know there's a great big wall in between catapult mattresses to the other side of town, thinking that that's at the heart of the gospel. When in fact, the stuff of charity is to say, I refuse to honor the invisible wall between my parish and the other side of town. I refuse to honor that. I refuse to give it any power. And so the beginning of charity is not the catapulting of mattresses to a place we've never been. It is building friendships, building rapport, building relationships. Again, back to Francis's language of missionary disciples and voluntary displacement, where we choose as a people to build relationships in places, and out of the logic of friendship, out of the logic of a shared faith, or the logic of just human engagement, then we begin to ask the questions, how can we together understand the best way to address the charitable needs of this part of town, and how can we best address together what are the structural and political and economic structures that are getting in the way of full human flourishing. You know, St. Irenaeus' notion of God's glory is the human person fully human and fully alive. What is discouraging the possibility of human flourishing on this side of town? And we want to do that work together. So when we have relationships then, not only can charity be done better, I mean, some of you know this book called Toxic Charity, on the New York Times bestseller list for a long time. And it's basically the history of how some charitable efforts have actually done more damage than good. I mean, here's the sobering fact. You can have a good heart. You can be really well-meaning. And you can do a lot of damage. And so we want our work to be effective. And one of the best ways to assure that it's work that will be effective and really necessary is to engage the voices of those who are in the wounded places, right? And so that relationship is absolutely so critical. So this displacement piece, again, I just want to bring it up because I think it has everything to do with politics, with the justice piece. And part of justice, the title today is advocating for justice. The language of advocacy, of course, is in some ways giving voice to, right? So we join our voices with those who are in harm's way, whose lives are struggled. We join our voices together to provide added weight to the political conversation. That is to say that there's two ways in this country to affect political decision making. One is cash, right? Whether it's cash donated to the campaigns of particular candidates, or or it's cash influencing in some other way, some legal, some not. The influence of certain political decisions. That's one way. The other way is to build such a strong voice, a large, wide voice, that you can make a political change based upon the momentum and the persuasion of the argument itself. Now I just will hasten to add, and I'm Christine, I'm coming near an end here, so you can. I will hasten to add. I get frequently confronted by absolutely committed Catholics about how I was given a talk on Catholic social teaching and the 7 themes, and I got to this piece about the political engagement. One guy raised his hand and says, Jack, I don't mean any disrespect, but I want to tell you I've been a Catholic for 64 years, and I've never seen any need mix my faith with political engagement, and this was in a workshop, right? And he was on, and he sat down, and I was just about had my response composed, and then suddenly this little woman, who when she stood up, she was no taller than when she was sitting down, and she had this broken German accent, and she said, "Sir, if you do not take your faith into politics, then you will end up with Hitler too." And then she sat down, and I didn't need to say a thing. So, let me just recap, and then Christine, you're on. I want to recap that the Catholic view of human institutions, that they have the capacity to do good. We also know they have the capacity to do evil. We have that view toward the political world. We understand politics can be an effective tool in God's hands to do great things in this world. It can be an effective partner to the work of churches and nonprofits and church agencies to see important things happen in the world. And so our view of this is a positive. But it doesn't ignore the fact that politics, like almost any other human institution, can also be used for damage. And there is powerful political damage that's possible. And I thought of one text that just popped into my head, and I wasn't ready for the thought that popped into my head. But here's my Bible, and now I'm ready. And this comes from, and now I don't have my glasses. This comes from the gentle, mild-mannered, soft-spoken Isaiah. Woe, woe to those who enact unjust statutes and who write oppressive decrees, depriving the needy of judgment and robbing my people's poor of their rights, making widows their plunder and orphans their prey. In other words, let me translate. Woe to those who pass lousy laws that keep people poor. Amen. Christine, you're on.
Well, thank you, Jack. So before I get started, I have a quick announcement. So there is a sandstone Toyota Camry parked facing the streets that has its hazard lights on.
From Twin Falls County.
2T K7337 license plate. I want to check in that other. Thank you to Jack again. That's the perfect introduction that I couldn't even hope to give to myself for this presentation. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit more is what is legislative advocacy and why is it important in Idaho and why do we need to all be engaged in it in each of our communities. Before I get into some of the data and details that I'm going to share with you, I wanted to introduce myself. So I do work for Catholic Charities of Idaho. I've been doing legislative advocacy for about 6 years. I've come to learn that politics is a love or hate relationship. Definitely, but I am a social worker, and I'm a very unique social worker because my calling is to work in the macro area, is to look at these systems and how we can better change our systems and our programs to help our clients, the people who are struggling, who are in need. When I was going through grad school, I realized pretty quickly that when I do direct practice, so if I'm meeting with somebody who has an issue, I get easily distracted because I'm listening to their story and I'm thinking, well, if you're bankrupt, why are you bankrupt? Is it because of a medical issue? Do you have a medical outstanding cost because you're uninsured? Why are you uninsured? Is there a policy putting you into that spot? And so naturally, I have moved on to take on kind of the legislative advocacy role. Legislative advocacy is a pretty broad term. For me, it means working primarily within state politics, although I do work in collaboration with USCCB, Catholic Charities USA on federal issues, but it's really working on the ground in trying to protect and help those who are struggling most in our community, the most poor and vulnerable. Most of my job is providing education. So I rarely see myself as a lobbyist. You know, I testified once or twice this last year. Most of my work is behind the doors, behind closed doors. So for example, I met with this legislator, freshman legislator this last session, and she had this assumption that there's this rampant fraud and abuse in the food stamp system. And so when I met with her, she was proposing, why don't we work on some policy that makes it harder for people to get their food stamps, that makes them prove that they really need it. And so I spent about an hour with her talking about, well, why is there such demand for food stamps in Idaho? Let's look at what is poverty. You know, when you make minimum wage at full time, it's $15,000 a year. The annual cost of living is about $24,000 in Idaho. So, you know, where are they making these decisions? How else do they put nutritious food on the table? And when we started talking about the program specifics and the individual person that the program helps, I saw the light bulb go off in her head. And now, you know, her next question was, how do we make it more accessible? How come not everybody knows about this? And how great and how much it helps, how it, you know, it helps people when they're down or, you know, when they're looking for a new job or they hit on hard times. So that primarily is what I see as my job. That, and then my other half of my job is something that I love doing, is community organizing. So working within the community, within parishes, and helping groups join together to, you know, let their voices be heard. So coalition building. And then working on messaging and campaigns, which I think Jack mentioned a little bit about messaging, because I know we all have a lot to say, but sometimes it's hard to get your message across correctly. But one of my biggest takeaways doing this over the last 6 years is, as I said, politics is love and hate, but I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't see the progress that we are making in Idaho. I see every day that I'm down at the legislature, every day that I'm coalition building and trying to engage new people in this work, I'm seeing progress. I see people wanting to do good, wanting to build better communities. The problem is I'm one of the very few in Idaho working on these social and economic justice issues. And so we just aren't having enough of us. So my progress is measured in little baby steps. But wouldn't it be great if we could engage all parishes in social justice committees to take action? And so for me to try to help get there, I do want to start with kind of where Idaho's at and why we need to start looking within our own communities when we're talking about social justice and where we need help. So in Idaho, if you look at individual family and individual well-being, we haven't been doing too great in the last little bit. So over the last 6 years, so about the end of the economic recession, let me back up. So the number of Idaho families earning a living wage has steadily dropped. So over the last 6 years, we're seeing our overall median income has been dropping. A lot of this is because although our unemployment rates are going down, most of our jobs in Idaho have been replaced with minimum wage jobs. And minimum wage in Idaho, like I said earlier, at full time only brings in about $15,000 a year. So with a family who's dependent on that income, it creates a lot of difficult decisions. So when you know that your annual cost of living, and if you notice it's in my little chart, it's only groceries, rent, utilities, and gasoline. We don't have childcare, braces, you know, co-pays, you name it. Families are having to make really difficult decisions. They're having to make a decision of, should I go to the doctor this month for this health screening that I really need, or should I put nutritious food on the table? Do I pay the utility bill, or do I pay my car payment? And we're seeing this increase. Like I said, it's definitely an issue that's not getting any better. So I could go on and on about Idaho's economic well-being and where we rank last in a lot of issues. But some of the top ones that we see really that I've been trying to address within the church is, so we do have really low crime rates in Idaho, but we also have one of the highest incarceration rates in the state. And not only that, but we have one of the highest prison recidivism rates. So when prisoners are being released out of jail into the community, we are not coming together as a community to provide support for those prisoners. Oftentimes they aren't able to access mental health care and they're ending up right back in prison. Another issue, I was talking about food stamps and the number of people reliant on state and federal aid. I think I had a number here of how many people are on food stamps. Nope. I do have, so the average food stamp recipient receives $1.27 per meal. So I always like to keep that in mind about what you could buy for $1.27 per meal. And then finally, the last statistic I have here is our healthcare system. Our healthcare system, despite a lot of advancements over the last couple of years with the Affordable Care Act, is really, really lacking. So right now we have 78,000 hardworking, large majority of them hardworking, Idaho adults who are falling into the health insurance coverage gap. This was just an unintended consequence when our state did not expand Medicaid. So these individuals don't make enough to qualify for subsidies on the health insurance exchange, and they make too little to qualify for Medicaid. So often, they're accessing health care in the emergency departments or just going without, costing our entire community in numerous ways. Or they're having to make a tough decision of quitting their job in order to become eligible for Medicaid, which is not something that advances the well-being of our communities. But it's not all that. So I don't like to do doom and gloom because we're all here and living in Idaho for a reason. And I think we could list off, 100 reasons why we love this state. And so what we need to do is tap into our love of Idaho, the love that we have for our community and our neighbors, our passion for social justice, our passion for the common good, and then mix in these shared values and then work together to ensure that we are protecting every citizen and that we're removing barriers to people who really want to prosper and succeed. And again, when we are able to help communities, help Idaho, increase our median income, for example, get people on healthcare, we help our communities as a whole. We have families who are more able to participate in community, stronger workforce. So for example, I was talking about the health insurance coverage gap. So if we were to close that gap and provide health care to that 78,000 individuals without it, our local, state, and county taxes would be decreased. We would pay less when we visited the doctor because the hospitals aren't taking on so much charity care. An estimated 15,000 new jobs will be created primarily in the healthcare field because of the influx of more people receiving healthcare. And families won't be bogged down with the medical debt that we're seeing so many people struggle with. So how do we work together towards justice? Because I know it seems really overwhelming when I go through all those statistics and you're thinking, at least when I look at it, well, I want to take on all those issues, but as I've learned over the years, you cannot take on the world. It's good to kind of find your passion, find that area that you want to work on, and then come together, because you're not alone in this, and there's a lot of great groups that I'll talk about who are really working towards social justice advocacy and who have campaigns and really easy ways for you to take action already set up. So what I really want to, this is kind of my version of Jack's charity versus justice, and I talk about this a lot with elected officials. So, for example, at Catholic Charities of Idaho, it's our job, we provide direct services to people in need. So, for example, we offer financial literacy classes to help people learn how to successfully bank and save, and hopefully save enough to buy an asset, such as a home. But often, our clients have too many barriers, systemic barriers, that they're not able to save. Maybe they are so bogged down in medical debt, they have to pay that down first. Maybe they don't have any safe lenders in their community, which is a huge issue. If you look around your communities, we have, more predatory payday lenders than we do fast food companies. I mean, it's unreal. So there's no safe lending, especially if you're bogged down in debt. You're probably not going to get approved for a loan. What else? So my point is, our clients often come to us wanting to build better lives, but they just can't get over these barriers. They're stuck. And so we, as service providers, all of you who are working on charity within your parishes, we need our elected officials to work with us to help us advance our cause. And I talk about that a lot. You know, that's an elected official's responsibility, is to protect their constituents, is to work with us to improve our programs. And then, hopefully, we all agree to that, and we start really working together. We start talking about, well, what is the best way to increase maybe our median wage, ensure that all families have living wages, and we start those discussions with our lawmakers, and hopefully we come to some conclusions and some solutions. So, after talking about kind of these broad area issues, I wanted to move on and talk about some of the legislative priorities, or what I like to kind of call hot topics, that the Diocese of Boise and Catholic Charities of Idaho is focused on. I do really want to stress this is not an all-inclusive list, and a lot of times how we come up with what our top priorities are, it's driven by what is the big issue nationally? What's the conversation? What are people willing to talk about, and what are they talking about? For example, was it Nebraska that just abolished the death penalty? Because of that, we're seeing it all over the national news, and it's the perfect time for us, Mark, to stand up with his table and say, let's abolish the death penalty, and it automatically, it's rising to the top because it's gaining salience, it's gaining attention, people are interested in it. So a lot of times, like I said, these hot topics, they aren't always chosen by us, but when we're looking at the political landscape, we want to see what's going on, what can we address right now. So, just a really quick overview, obviously within the diocese, okay, sorry, I skipped over my last slide, because I did really want to highlight the policies that we do choose and why. We're looking at policies that protect human life and dignity. We really want to have policies that promote a better quality of life for every person, and we want to be really clear that we're not just talking about citizens, because often our laws that we create are only for citizens, and then we have a large undocumented immigrant population left out. And then we also want to just ensure that policies are not creating barriers to the family's ability to become financially stable and secure and independent. So with that, I'm going to go through a few of these issues. I'm not going to go into any detail because obviously I could talk your ear off on any one of these issues for an hour. And I'm going to be more than happy to share my information with any of you after this. So Respect Life, I put eliminate the death penalty up top there. Shout out to Mark. He's doing a great job making this a really top priority issue within the diocese, and I really think we will see movement on this in the next couple of years. We'll continue to protect the unborn and eliminate access to abortions. Every year it seems like we're making strides towards putting increased restrictions in this area, and we'll continue to work there. Comprehensive immigration reform. So this is primarily being led on the federal level because it pretty much has to come from a federal level. And This is a huge issue with lots of movement and lots of influence in our communities, and I would love to go in a lot more detail on this someday. And then poverty elimination, so healthcare, so ensuring that everyone has access to affordable healthcare. Hunger, ensuring that the programs that we do have are protected and enhanced to make sure that everybody has food, nutritious food, that kids are not going to bed hungry because their parents didn't have the money to make it through the month to put food on the table. And then economic security. So this is an issue where Catholic Charities of Idaho and I've been specifically interested in because we talk so much about families becoming independent and secure and contributing members within our community, but oftentimes, like I was saying, there's barriers and there's things holding them back that are outside of their control. And so this is an area we work in a lot. Okay. Oh, do I have a little graphic? I didn't realize this one. Okay. So the legislative process, I'm not going to bore you and go into how a bill becomes a law in Idaho because it's really complicated. I actually, in preparation for this, I actually have a chart, and it is the most confusing little pathway with arrows that point other ways. But guess what? As on-the-ground constituents wanting to do legislative advocacy, you don't need to know those details. What you need to know is your stories and the passion that you have to share for issues. You have people like me who can then help guide you and others in how a bill becomes a law. But what's really important to know is because that's such a complicated path of how a bill becomes a law, that the process is extremely slow. And I have heard from several people new to Idaho, it's even slower in Idaho. So we say anytime you take on a campaign, you're looking at least a 3 to 5 year commitment. And these are for pretty simple campaigns. So you know that you just writing your legislator or going to their office to talk to them isn't necessarily going to make a difference this session, but in the long run it should. And so in legislative advocacy, we do set our goals and our objectives very short term because talking to one more elected official means a lot and gets us one step closer to our ultimate goal, whatever that is. The legislative process definitely varies between legislative bodies. Idaho's unique, and so is every other state in how we do business. The uniqueness in Idaho, though, I think is important for each of you as constituent citizen advocates, because Idaho, we have very few legislative staffers, very few. So pretty much a majority of our legislators don't have any staff to help them. Most don't have interns, and especially when it's their freshman year, they get thrown on 3 to 4 committees and instantly have to hit the ground running. So they are open to people coming in who are experts or who have worked in a field and who know the area. They're open to people coming in and helping give guidance. And I think that's really important for each of you to know. And, you know, guidance can be just what you see day to day. You know, what's your neighbor's story? What's your story? What are your struggles? What are your passions? And I have found legislators, especially in the state, are more than happy to talk to anybody who will come in and offer them information. And when you look at who's at the State House, this is often lobbyists, pretty high-paid lobbyists. And so, of course, my goal is to try to recruit all of you to come down with me so that we can outnumber all of those high-paid lobbyists. Because just like Jack was saying, it's money and the number of people getting involved. What else? So, also, I put in here knowing when your voice will be heard. Again, you don't have to be an expert in the legislative process. That's my job. That's the network's job if you're going to get involved in a campaign. But what you do need to know is that there are really good times to talk to your legislators and not so effective times. You know, if you're trying to start and build a relationship with an elected official, Summertime is great when they're home, in their districts, and you can just sit down and have a chat. It's probably not the best time to say, pass Senate Bill 1067, because that doesn't exist in the summer. So just really knowing when your voice will be heard, and I do a lot of trainings in how to talk to elected officials, how to frame your messaging, and I'd be happy to help when all of you go back to your parishes and get really involved in your social justice committees. So I just tried to quickly brainstorm different networks and coalitions that are in Idaho who focus on social and economic justice issues. Again, this was how many I could fit on the slide. There's so many more. But my point of throwing all these coalitions up on the slide and networks is to see that if you have a passion, if you have a neighbor who's really struggling, maybe because they have a son who's in prison and is getting ready to be released, and you know all the barriers that he's going to be faced with when he comes out, that we're creating a coalition focused in this area. And what's really great about a lot of these coalitions is they do a lot of the behind-the-scenes work for you. So coming up with messaging that works with legislators and works with the public, giving you fact sheets that we have on all these topics, so you don't have to go and do your own research. And then oftentimes providing action alerts of saying, hey, guess what? Tomorrow this bill is being printed, so write your legislator now, call your legislator now. And if you want to get involved, I put all of these up here because they're mainly groups that I'm involved in, but I do know quite a few others. So if you're interested, let me know. Over the years, I've helped create quite a few coalitions and committees. And so I'm open. I do lots of trainings on what faithful citizenship is, which is a great little document from USCCB, on messaging. So how do you tell your story without debating, without making the other side extremely angry? How do you have a dialogue with somebody? How to be an advocate. So how do you go down to the state house and meet with an individual? And then issue specifics. So if you're really curious about healthcare policy in Idaho, I'd be happy to help and sit or connect you to someone else who might know. So really, this is my concluding slide, I think, yeah. So as we've been talking so much about getting involved in the social mission of the church here, it's really important to continually think about how that involves legislative advocacy. What systems need change, what programs need to be created in order to work to create a better community, a stronger, happier, healthier community. And as I've been saying, you don't have to be an expert in the legislature to be an advocate. You just have to have passion and a reason to be there and involved and ready to step up and say, I care about this issue because my neighbor is impacted. I care about this issue because it's bringing down my community. I care about this issue because my daughter can't afford to go to the doctor. And really focusing on what you have to say. I have an example, I'm trying to see if there's anybody in here, of how I can help groups get involved. So we had a Sacred Heart parish, is somebody in here? Okay, a couple of you. Sacred Heart Parish go through a Just Faith program, and they got involved in St. Vincent de Paul's prison reentry program. And there's a group of these individuals who started realizing, well, when people come out into the community, they're left behind. Our communities, there's so many barriers, there's so many things holding them back and not letting them move forward, no matter how hard they try. So most people, when they get released from prison, don't qualify for any type of health insurance. So a lot of them lose access to their mental health care and their prescriptions. A lot of individuals have unrealistic job application restrictions and what they have to do that they just can't meet until they get other, housing, and making sure that they're mentally stable and ready to be in the community. And a lot of these individuals don't have a support system. They don't have somebody to call and say, help, I'm having thoughts about, going and having a drink. And so this group came to me and they said, we're really interested in looking at how we can change policy to better help reduce these recidivism rates. So how do we help these individuals come into the community? And so when I chatted with the group, I suggested, why don't we go down to the Capitol and talk to the chair of the Judiciary and Rules Committee. She's heading up the criminal justice reform movement right now in Idaho. And to my surprise, they said, sure, let's do it. So we went, I think it was a week or two after, and it was such a great meeting. The senator was so open, and she had told me afterwards she had never had a group like that come in and just honestly tell their stories. Because what we did, we went in without really too much of an agenda. But what I wanted to happen, what they wanted to happen, was just introduce to this legislator what it really looks like on the ground. So what are these issues? And they built this relationship with her, so now as they're starting to look at criminal justice reform and look at, well, how do we reduce recidivism rates? These individuals will be on call, and they'll say, hey, have you ever seen this as an issue, or what do you think about this? And so that is a perfect example of moving from charity into social justice advocacy. And I think pretty successfully. And I hope that from that, we will then spread into other communities and looking at, well, what other groups within the parish have a story to tell and can be on the ground as well. So that's kind of all I had, and I had some time for question and answers, and I'm sure for Jack to jump in and fill in any gaps or notes that you were taking. But I do really want to stress, so I have a lot of resources, and when I was trying to think today about legislative advocacy and what to talk about, I decided to do a pretty high level and put it out there that if you want to really get active and involved, I would be more than happy to work with you or any of your groups and do trainings in how do you talk to an elected official, in talking more in depth about, well, what is this healthcare coverage gap that you keep talking about, and then talking about any of the criminal justice issues. So I do have a table full of resources up here with some handouts. I have a how to contact your legislator, just some tips for advocacy, a lot of fact sheets, how to get involved. If you do better reading an article, I have some of my articles that have been printed in the Idaho Catholic Register, thanks to Mike. So I'm going to kind of leave it at that and turn it over to any questions or discussions we have, or to Jack.
Christine, I have a question. I'm up north, so we get a lot of Washington news, and King County is in the middle of raising their minimum wage to $15 an hour. So what I never hear is how, when you change something in economics, it affects all the variables. So what is the rate that we can raise minimum wage and not overly affect the cost for a family of four? So where's that break-even point where, if we raised it $2 an hour or $5 an hour, what would that do to how much it costs for a family of four to live for a year?
That is a great question, and luckily, I don't have to know the answer. And I'm saying that in the sense that my job is to bring together people who are interested. So you're asking this, you're really curious. So let's bring you together with the experts and the legislators, and let's have this discussion, because there is different resources that say different things. So how do we come together as a community to decide what that is? I'm sure that, this side over here has their statistics and their resources, and this side over here has theirs. But let's meet in the middle and talk about, well, what is happening when minimum wage is $7.25? We know what's happening right now. So how can we come and meet in the middle and have a dialogue and start working towards what that answer is? And I'm not going to be able to give you that answer because being a legislative advocate, I do educate on, current issues. But luckily, we have a whole slew of economists and policy experts who then can jump into that step. And if you're ready to start getting involved, I would be happy to make some connections of people you can ask that question to, because I
So
don't.
there aren't statistics available on that? Nobody's like...
Oh, there's plenty of statistics. The problem is choosing kind of your resource. So, and getting both sides to come together to choose a resource that works together. I could give you probably some statistics that Jack can give you something that's completely different. And so I think our job as advocates who are advocating for the most poor and vulnerable, who want to build better communities, is trying to figure out how do we bring all that information together and make a collective decision. Not what does my statistics say, what does your statistics say, if that makes sense. And I can connect you to some people who do have strong opinions on that, but yeah, just not sure.
Mine's a real simple question, is just people like her, oh, I'm really loud, that are just interested. So part of my job within the parish is our website, just kind of making sure people have the contacts. So is this the information you want us to provide, or do you have a better way that you want people to contact your group and how to get involved?
That's a good question. I'm thinking through. I would say feel free to share my information, and then we do have a link on Catholic Charities of Idaho website, and we could probably work a whole lot better within the diocese to do that as well. It's always a work in progress, and how do you give the best resources. So we can chat after. I have a business card, so if you're wanting specifics, definitely grab my card and let me know, but feel free to share my information.
And if the short and simple answer is just connect to Catholic Charities of Idaho, then
I think, yeah, that we'll get to the same endpoint, so yes, that works.
I just, I'm listening, and you talk about trying to get something into Congress or the legislature. Think about 1926. Does anybody know the bill that was presented? Anybody? Women's rights. You know, every year, the year passed, 1968. Be patient.
Thank
Be
you.
persistent. Don't let go. Every year. It'll come.
And I think you're touching on one of the hardest parts of engaging in this ministry, is that it takes a lot of time and you have to have patience. I often see people who are so excited to get involved and go down to the State House and share their stories. And at the end of the session, when the bill doesn't pass, they are just destroyed and let down. And so how do we work together to provide a community so that when we have those letdowns, we have other people around us to push us back up? And then also, how do we celebrate the little successes? Because I guarantee in those, 30 years, they had a whole bunch of successes along the way. And so how do we look at that as progress? But thank
Congress
you.
allowed them to keep presenting it.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you.
There was an attempt in northern Idaho to get the whole idea of improving the minimum wage. Part of the problem is there were not enough signatures. And so maybe that's something we can continue to encourage our people to do. When things come up, don't be afraid to sign. Because it just died because there were not enough signatures to get before the good legislators.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, that legislative advocacy is not just on the ground at the State House calling up your legislators. There's other routes, such as a voter initiative, which are very difficult to pass in Idaho. But yeah, no, thank you. I mean, be aware, especially if you want to get involved in any of these coalition and networks, they'll hopefully raise awareness for the different routes that people are going. Besides voter initiatives and on-the-ground lobbying, you know, there's lots of different rallies, community organizing tactics, different ways to show your support for an issue in large numbers. So thank you for that, and thanks for bringing that up.
Going off what the first gentlelady said, wage equality, which is a good thing, but it can become an ambiguous term. So I kind of maybe what she was getting at is how can we advocate for equality that really is justice? Because if we just say something general and ambiguous like we like wage equality and then leave it to the politicians, they're politicians, they will do politician things and based on other things besides just justice. So maybe how could we be a little more specific in a way that we can find actual justice in that issue?
I think that is a great point, and you guys are picking up right in the middle of where all the minimum wage coalition and work is right now. Groups have not come together to decide on that magic number. Groups are arguing on, should we have a living wage? Should we have a minimum wage? Is it a just wage? And so I would say additional generated interest and maybe leaders, he's walking away, who want to step up and help lead a cause, we can come together to come up with these solutions. And that's part of the legislative process and the advocacy process. And you guys are hitting right on, this is a brand new issue in Idaho. I think I've been hearing about a move to increase the minimum wage for only about 2 years now, recently in Idaho. So we're in the beginning steps of it, and if you would like to get involved, this is absolutely the time to help shape and influence those where we're going here. Please jump in.
I just wanted to add one best practice that I bumped into and one fresh possibility that I find very intriguing from Pope Francis. So the best practice piece is to take a kind of easy issue and engage your parish in a letter writing campaign because for a lot of people it would be the first time they've ever written a legislator. The number of people who actually write in on political campaigns is very, very small. And by way of encouragement, Arthur Simon, who was the Lutheran pastor who started Bread for the World, for those of you who don't know, Bread for the World is a Christian hunger lobby. And Arthur Simon was asked, you know, what difference does writing one letter, you know, what difference does it make? And he had a wonderful answer. He said 2 years ago, and this was many years ago that he said this, but he said 2 years prior, they had done the metrics on how many letters were written, the presumed impact in terms of increased legislation for providing resources for people who were underserved in the food system, and that their estimate is that for every letter written, the impact was one life saved in terms of international aid. Now that's an enormous. I mean, does anybody have anything better to do than to write a letter that might save a life? That's one thing. So that's the best practice. The other thing that I find very intriguing is Pope Francis is encouraging parishes to do discernments about approaching parishioners who of deep faith and perhaps some political skill set to run for office. The assumption, again, going back to that positive view of politics, that we have something at stake in people of faith holding political office. So parishes, actually in some ways, to get together, consider their constituency, and actually commission, encourage, and promote somebody to run for office exactly because that person carries with them some ability to communicate a vision about the civil society, which is the way we translate our faith into sort of political language, and a person who might have a particular skill set that could make them an effective legislator. So I just think that's a lovely, wonderful option, and it comes straight from the Pope. So.
I'm just throwing this slide up here, just so you can look at, within a parish, what can you do and what can't you do. As a church entity, you can do whatever you want individually representing yourself. But just an FYI, I'll throw that up there to look. And I did want to add on to Jack's comment about those letters. Letters and emails and phone calls go a very long way, and I can tell you legislators track those numbers, and they mean a lot. I have asked any one of my legislative friends, and they can tell me on the spot, oh, the child support issue, we had 450 for and 350 against. And they have those tallies running. So even if it's just a short letter that says I support this or I support that, it definitely goes a long ways. So don't think your voice doesn't count, because it absolutely does.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah. Christine, what is the cost of doing what we cannot do?
The cost of doing
It
that.
says understand what you cannot do.
Sorry. Going philosophical there. I don't see it.
I think the
I've
question,
decided that I am not. I'm going to endorse somebody for the parish. My parish is going to support the candidate. Openly support the candidate.
No, they cannot. So,
What if we do? What is the cost?
any lawyers in the
So you lose your 501c3 status, which means that your members can't deduct their contribution from their taxes.
As a fundraiser, I understand.
No.
Good question.
Is there another cost?
Yeah, Bishop Soto. Bishop Soto, please.
I'm kind of later in the program, but let me address this, because the nonprofit stuff always comes up, which is, it is true, that's a reality, you can lose your nonprofit status. But I think more importantly, when you get into the business of enforcing candidates, you actually jeopardize the integrity of the gospel message, and that's very, very critical. I mean, the gospel is a lot bigger than a candidate or an issue. And we are always better when we stand on the firm ground of our tradition and not compromise that by, a narrow partisan agenda. So I think you weaken your moral voice as an institution or as a parish if you begin to start making choices like that, which will, in a certain sense, short change the gospel. So that would be my
Thank you.
thank you. We're going to take a brief break now for about a half an hour before the next presentation. There is a greeting card for Bishop Mike on this table, wishing him a happy anniversary. So if you take some time during this break to come up and sign Bishop Mike's anniversary card, that would be great.